Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to episode 63 of Keeping Water. In this week's episode, I'm taking a look at the amount of suspended detritus I have in the pond, why it's there, and what I can possibly do about it. Other than detritus, the pond's been reassuringly quiet. The fish have appeared calm and well, the leaves are staying nicely outside the pond, and the water, detritus aside, is healthy. Just how you'd want things as we move through autumn and into winter, and when you'll soon be getting new fish. Although, as I said last week, I'm not going to mention getting the new fish anymore until they actually get here. In fact, this is the first week that I'm not going to mention them. I think we can all agree I've successfully not mentioned the new fish, and I'll continue not to mention them right up until they arrive. Right then, before we get started with the video, just my usual request that if you're new or just not yet subscribed, to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in what I'm doing here, and a request to everyone to like the video if you enjoy it, and to share the video and the channel to anyone you think might be interested. Right, housekeeping and not mentioning the imminently arriving new fish all done, so it's time to start taking a look at muck, mess and detritus. In a recent clip video I made, I spoke briefly about the amount of detritus that was in the pond. At the time, I felt it was normal for the time of year, a combination of plants dying off and leaves falling, as well as the fish tending to be quite hungry as we approach autumn. But since making that, I've been thinking more about it, and I do think that, although the leaves and some of the detritus on the floor of the pond are pretty similar to previous years, even slightly less, although more of that later, the suspended detritus seems a lot more. Which was puzzling really, as since last year I've made some small but significant improvements to the filtration to capture more fines if anything, and, I thought, improve flow through the pond. Yet the water seems to have more muck floating about rather than less. Before I discuss why I think that may be the case, I'll take a look at some comparison videos to see if it's actually true in the first place. The first videos are of the surface, both shot in a similar direction from the front to the back and slightly to the left. Shots towards the surface often show fines quite clearly, sometimes seeming to exaggerate the amount, as often small items suspended in the water reflect sunshine, making them stand out more. So, the one on the left is from this year, and the water has a multitude of suspended items. Not all of them are detritus, but more of that in a bit. Look into the clip on the right, and there's a lot less suspended fines in the water. Admittedly, the camera is at a slightly different angle, and it wasn't quite such a sunny day, but even taking all that into account, I think there's far less detritus in the water. Right, now to another couple of comparison videos. Again, on the left is a recent video which again shows a lot of suspended detritus moving in the flow. Again, not all muck as such, but clearly a lot of fines and not so fine muck and plant matter. The video on the right is from last year, and there's noticeably less muck in the water. Similar light, similar angle, so it's not that. There's still a fair amount on the floor of the pond, but far less floating up in the water. Which is all a little confusing, as this past 12 months, as I've said, I've added things to the pond which should have helped in this regard, if only a little. They are filter floss in the skimmer, improvements to the mechanical bays in the multi-bay, and using a pond vac, all of which should mean less detritus of whatever size in the water, but there still seems to be more. So, has looking at these videos shown clearly one way or the other? Certainly, there's more objects. However, what's also clear at a closer look is that not all of these objects are detritus. If you look at a lot of it, you'll see it's white and almost perfectly circular, so clearly a lot of these are bubbles from the comparatively recent added air disc. There's a ton of them in the water now, especially on the right half of the pond. So that's part of the answer, but there's still a lot of other items that aren't bubbles, although I think the air might play a role in that also. Before adding the air disc, I'd often have detritus gathering on the floor of the pond in that right rear corner, which, prior to getting the pond vac, I'd net out at reasonably regular intervals. Now it can't settle there. The flow caused by the air stops anything settling there and drags and pushes it up and away from the corner, which is no bad thing at all. Theoretically, it's helping to move it towards the areas of the pond where it could be picked up by the filters, which, unfortunately, I think may be the problem, as I'm not sure, although it's heading in the right direction, that it is actually reaching the filters, or at least in significant amounts. So, there's 2 points of entry into my filters, the main pump on the floor of the pond in the bottom left corner, and the skimmer at the front on the surface. Neither really draws in from mid-water, and unless detritus is caught at the surface, or sinks and is close enough to the pump, it just floats and flows around the pond. If it does eventually sink, but not close enough to the pump, I may then get it when I pond vac. So looking at my pond and possible flows within it, and there's probably, well definitely, plenty of flaws with it. As I said, there's 2 outlets to the filters, here into the skimmer and down here where the pump is. Therefore there's some surface flow towards the skimmer here, and some flow along the floor of the pond towards the pump. There's problems with that, but more later. The inlets from the filtration are here and here, from the filter shed, and here, which is the return from the skimmer. The drain pipe return sends water quite slowly downwards and doesn't do too much to the overall direction of flow in the pond. The other return from the shed returns slightly underwater and can be directed either straight down or almost at the surface and sideways. The skimmer returns just at the surface, with a reasonable flow along the back wall and around the pond. Next, there's the air disc. It pushes water at the surface outwards, although mainly due to it being in the corner, outwards towards the left side and towards the skimmer at the front. It also draws water upwards to the surface. And finally there's the splitter, which pushes water away from the pump, unhelpfully, and pushes water along and slightly up from the bottom. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know why it's there. It's full of problems and will hopefully be out of there in the new year. Right, so this is the overall picture. Water flows in from the filter returns at the back right corner. Some moves along or just below the surface along the back to the left, under the plants, and some flows downwards behind the airstone. The airstone pushes water up and then across the surface of the right half of the pond, just about reaching the skimmer. The flow into it also helps to focus the surface flow to drag any floating rubbish to where it needs to be. Under the surface, water is being dragged towards the pump, but not really from that far or with any force. Additionally, water is also being pumped away by the splitter. As you can see in this clip, small quite light particles are falling near to the pump, but moving away from it rather than being pulled into it. I'm not sure how reliable judging flow by watching those particles is, however. Clearly, looking at the state of my multi-bay before each clean, it's bringing in a reasonable amount of dirt, and the skimmer is likewise. But equally, there's still a lot of suspended detritus that's just circulating around the pond, not being picked up by either. Which makes me think that my filters, such as they are, with the budget I've got, do a reasonable job with what they've got to work with, and although things could probably always be better, they're not the reason for the increased amount of visible fines. I say visible because I don't think there's actually more, just that while suspended in the water, they're easier to see. The problem is that my system is really inefficient in getting much into the filters in the first place, which has been exacerbated by the air disc. Although the air disc keeps muck off the bottom in an area where it likes to settle, this doesn't really help, as firstly it's not then efficiently collected and passed to the filters, and secondly, as it's now off the bottom, it's also not collected when I pond vac. Therefore, it just circulates around the pond in mid-water, escaping the filters. So, what can I do to improve things? There's an elephant in the room that I'll get to in a bit, but the first practical thing I can do is get rid of the splitter. That is pushing part of the water pumped by the pump back into the pond. It's there for a reason, but New Year plans for the pond will mean its time is limited. The next thing is to turn down the air disc. I think it would be fine to have less air going in, except for where things are at their hottest, or if there's a risk of surface freezing. That would be a sensible test, if nothing else. I could also adjust the direction of flow from the two filter outlets, maybe so they're either pointed down more or push more water below the surface. Alternatively, I could turn the skimmer outlet to flow the other way around the pond. I could also think about moving the position of the pump. I think that moving it closer to the middle rather than the corner would help. However, by that I don't mean right in the middle of the pond. I mean in the middle along its length, but still along the side, probably next to the drop-off. The reason why I'm not putting it right in the middle of the pond is based around aesthetics. I really want to hide as much pipework and equipment as possible, not just from the side of the pond, but also when filming underwater. Obviously this compromises the efficiency of my system, but that's a long-standing challenge of my pond, and while it makes everything more difficult, it's also more rewarding when I succeed, if I can say I ever do. I also thought about whether to take the cage off the pump and whether that would help. I'd have to cover the inlet with some mesh to stop the fry getting into it and any muck that wouldn't pass easily through. Again, I'm not sure it would help, but it's an experiment if nothing else. So, on to the elephant in the room, and something I'm sure many viewers would have thought about 10 minutes ago, a bottom drain. If I made my pond again, or did a second rebuild, I might well put a bottom drain in, but that's years and a ton of cash away, and not a viable option for now. A retro bottom drain is however more feasible, although equally not cheap. However, it fails on two key points, at least to me. Firstly, aesthetics again. It looks pretty awful. And secondly, I'm trying to reduce the amount of plastic in the pond by removing the splitter, and it would somehow defeat the point. So, although I'm sure many would disagree, they're out. Therefore, the plan is to improve the flow by removing the splitter, changing the angles of the filter outlets, turning down the airflow through the air disc, and moving the pump to a more central, yet still hidden position. I'd welcome any thoughts, although I'm fairly stuck on my bottom drain position and pretty much have no budget, so it'd be tricky to think of options. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Keeping Water, I really do appreciate it. If you've enjoyed it, please like and comment and subscribe if you're not already. I'm not sure what will be in next week's episode, but I may well be taking a look at the fish under the water and under the netting. I definitely won't be mentioning the new fish though. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.